Okay, we're going to talk about green accounting for both companies and corporations. I'm going to start by talking about GDP, what it can and cannot do. Most of that is familiar to you. And then I'm going to spend longer on talking about the environmental product and its derivation or its derivative, genuine savings. I'm going to talk a bit about alternative indicators, particularly the ecological footprint, and all these terms will become clear. And all that stuff is at a national level, and then at the end, depending on how much time is left, I'm going to talk about environmental accounting for companies. That's the plan. This is the last lecture. As I said just now, this will actually be on the exam. But yeah, it ends after today, right? So, gross domestic product. Last week we met Simon Kuznets. Now we meet him again. Gross domestic product was defined by Simon Kuznets in 1925, and for this work he earned his Nobel Prize. And the GDP is commonly known as the conventional measure of economic performance. It tracks the economy over time, and if you normalize it with the size of the population, it's also used to compare the economic activity of different countries over space. GDP is often used as a measure of economic performance and as a measure of human welfare. Kuznets himself wrote 7 years after he proposed it that the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from the measurement of national income. Kuznets himself never intended this as a measure of welfare. GDP is a measure of economic activity. It measures three things actually. It measures total demand. How much stuff do we together buy, where that includes also companies and governments. It measures total income. How much do we collectively earn, where we again includes companies, and it also measures how much value was added. And those are also the three ways of measuring GDP. And the original table says here that these measurements are identical. They are identical in theory, but in practice they are rarely the same. Right? So three ways of defining GDP: total demand, total consumption, total income, or total value added. That is GDP. Robert Kennedy, shortly before he was shot, said the following: even if we act to erase material poverty, there is another greater task. It is to confront the poverty of satisfaction, purpose and dignity that afflicts us all. Too much and for too long we seem to have surrendered personal excellence and community values in the mere accumulation of material things. Our gross national product now is over $800 billion a year, but that gross national product, if we judge the United States of America by that gross national product, counts air pollution and cigarette advertising and ambulances to clear our highways of carnage. It counts special locks for our doors and the jails for the people who break them. It counts the destruction of the redwood and the loss of our natural wonder in chaotic urban sprawl. He did not say the word urban, I added that. It counts napalm, this was the Vietnam War, and it counts nuclear warheads and armored cars for the police to fight the riots in our cities. It counts Richmond's rifle and Speck's knife and the television programs which glorify violence in order to sell toys to our children. Yet the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of our education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry, or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, that was a long time ago, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except which makes life worthwhile. And it can tell us everything about America except why we are proud that we are Americans. This was in his presidential campaign, right? That did not end well. If this is true here at home, so it is true elsewhere in the world, right? So Kennedy essentially here sums up everything that is wrong with GDP. It measures economic activity. It does not measure economic welfare. He also highlights environmental issues, right? And that is, of course, what we're going to talk about. So there's all sorts of things wrong with GDP. It counts investment, but not depreciation of capital stock. And then, of course, we immediately have Bastiat's, who you see displayed here, broken window fallacy. That if you break a window, GDP goes up, because we don't count the capital depreciation, the breaking of the window, but we do count the repair services and replacement. And for that purpose, we have, of course, invested net domestic product, where I should have emphasized net rather than domestic. And GDP is limited to transactions that take place on the market. So homework is not included, subsistence farming is not included, defensive expenditure is crudely included, crime is hard to measure, right? It's easy to measure the salaries that go to the police officers, but the negative consequences of crime are much harder to include, and for our purposes it does not include environmental issues at all. Furthermore, GDP is a total measure. It just adds up income, but it says nothing about the distribution of that income. And it does not measure sort of immaterial things such as freedom. So GDP is wrong in all sorts of ways, or rather, GDP does one thing very specifically, namely it measures the scale of economic activity, and that's it. And what has happened over the last almost 100 years now is that people try to do with GDP things that it was never designed for, and therefore fail to deliver. GDP as a measure of economic activity is unsurpassed and uncriticized. It is a good measure of economic activity. But we are interested in environmental issues. And therefore people have invented the environmental net domestic product. So at a macro level, GDP is equal to consumption plus investment, total expenditure, right? Now the net domestic product is consumption plus investment minus depreciation of the physical capital stock. And then we have a much better idea of the economic potential of an economy if we look at net domestic product. Of course, depreciation is hard to measure, and therefore numbers about GDP are much more easy to find than numbers about NDP. The environmental domestic product adds two terms. One is our investment in nature, P, and the other is the degradation of nature, minus N. And then we have a more complete picture of how our economy is faring. The justification for this goes back to this bunch of equations that you see here, and I long hesitated to put them up because this is not something that you have seen before. unless you studied physics or mathematics next to economics. What you're used to is solving maximization problems either unconstrained or constrained, and then you follow Lagrange's methods. What I'm going to show you is Hamilton's methods to solve a dynamic system. And just like few of you guys would be able to prove that a Lagrangian does what it does, but you know how it works, just in theory, you know how it works. The Hamiltonian or Hamilton's methods are just a trick that you can learn, and I've long argued that this actually should be in your calculus curriculum, unsuccessful so far, but it is helpful to know these tricks, because it actually generates insight rather than just complication. So we want to maximize a stream of utility over time, right? So we have material consumption C, and then the utility function U of C. It's an increasing function. The more you consume, the happier you are. And that stream goes into the indefinite future. And we want to maximize the net present value of that thing. So we want to discount it in continuous time, e to the power minus rho. There is a t missing there. It should be e to the power minus rho t. And then we take the integral of that, right? I did not talk to you guys about discount factors in discrete and continuous time, right? So you're used to a discount factor that is 1 over 1 plus rho to the power t. And we typically think of the rho in that equation as the annual discount or the annual interest rate. But why annual? Why would you want to make these decisions in time steps of a year? And what you could do is define an interest rate not in annual time steps, not in yearly time steps, but in monthly time steps or in daily time steps. And actually the interest that your bank calculates on your student loans is not based on an annual interest rate, but it's based on a daily interest rate. But why days? You can do it in hours, you can do it in minutes, you can do it in seconds, right? And if you make that time step of evaluation smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, then 1 over 1 plus rho to the power t goes to e to the power minus rho t. That's another thing that they did teach you at calculus. The limit of that function for ever smaller time steps is e to the power minus rho t, and that's what you see here. We're working in continuous time. Now, the maximization of a function like this is something you have never seen before, right? But it is actually not that complicated. So that is the thing that we want to maximize, and that is of course subject to the equation of motion of capital. But the change in the capital stock is the investment you put in. So K dot is the change in the capital stock. We put in investment I, and there's of course depreciation delta K. Right? And then our investment is of course the total production Q of K, that's the only factor of production, minus what we consume. Right? Now the optimization of a system like this is done through a function called the Hamiltonian, after Hamilton, the mathematician who came up with this. And the Hamiltonian that you want to form is the H that you see there on the third line. And the Hamiltonian is actually pretty simple. It just takes as its first component the instantaneous objective function. So we do away with all the net present stuff, and we just take the instantaneous utility function u of c. So no integral, no discounting, that's gone, right? And the second component of the Hamiltonian is also straightforward. We take the co-state variable lambda, which you can think of as a shadow price, but it's not. It's a co-state variable. Just a change in terminology, times the change in the corresponding capital stock. That's the Hamiltonian, which looks a bit like a Lagrangian, but it is not. It's a Hamiltonian. So that is relatively simple. You do away with all the funny stuff in your objective function. You just take instantaneous welfare, and then you have a variable, let's just call it a shadow price, times the left-hand side of our constraint, right? And then just as with the Lagrangian, we set the first partial derivative of the Hamiltonian to 0. Those are our first order conditions. So there's two first order conditions. One is that you take the first partial derivative of the Hamiltonian to the decision variable. In this case, how much should we consume? So the HDC should equal 0. And the HDC is, well, K dot does not depend. Oh, K dot does depend on C, right? We substituted that in. So that becomes minus lambda, because K dot is K does not depend on C, Q does not depend on C, but minus CT does depend on C, but the first partial derivative of C to C is 1. Minus C is minus 1, so that becomes minus lambda. And the other term that you see there is the first partial derivative of utility to consumption, right? So we have that marginal utility equals the co-state variable lambda. That's our first order condition, which almost looks like a Lagrangian condition. The second first order condition is weird, and that is that the change in the shadow price minus the discount rate times the shadow price should equal the first partial derivative of the Hamiltonian to the corresponding stock variable K, dH and K. Now the good thing about the Hamiltonian is that it gives you the static conditions for efficiency and the dynamic conditions for efficiency separately. So the first thing that we see here is that marginal utility should equal the shadow price of capital. That's just your standard investment criteria, right? You should not invest more than what that investment is worth. That's essentially how to read this. The other part essentially tells you how the shadow price of capital should evolve over time. Right? Your lambda dot is your change in your shadow price of capital. And that equation there is a differential equation that tells you how that price evolves over time. Now, solving this requires knowledge of solving differential equations. But the first bit is just static. So essentially what the Hamiltonian does is it sort of like separates the dynamic part of your optimization problem from your instantaneous welfare. And the good thing about GDP is that it's just a snapshot of the economy. We're actually not so much interested in the evolution over time. So I'm not going to solve the lambda dot minus rho lambda is the HDK. I'm just going to focus on the first order condition, the static first order condition, namely that marginal utility should equal lambda. So we have that. We substitute that back into the Hamiltonian itself. So the lambda we can replace with marginal utility. Then we approximate utility with linearly by taking the level of consumption times the first partial derivative of utility to consumption. So U of C is approximately equal to U sub C times C. That's just linearization. And then we divide both sides of the equation by marginal utility, U sub C, And then what we have is that the first part of the Hamiltonian derived by marginal utility, or divided by marginal utility, I should say, equals consumption plus the change in the capital stock. That is depreciation minus investment, or investment minus depreciation, rather. So the normalized Hamiltonian is our net domestic product. Is the insight that we get from this? The first one to realize this and write this up was the young Marty Weitzman, who we have met before in prices versus quantities. And we'll meet again next term. Now you wonder, why am I doing this, right? So let's add nature to the production function. Or, yeah, no, I added nature to the utility function. So we don't just care about material consumption C, but we also care about the state of the environment N. We care about nature as it is. And we can spend part of our income, P, on making nature better. And then N dot is the change in nature, is some sort of function of how nature is now. You can call it depreciation, but it can also be the regeneration. I have no opinion about the sign of the theta that you see there, but we can make an effort to make it better by investing P. But of course, if we spend money on P, then we don't spend money on material consumption. Right? So the red terms are the ones that were not in the previous one. We have an additional equation of motion, and we have an additional argument in our utility function. Hamiltonian then becomes instantaneous utility. There should be an N there as well. Not a typo. Plus the co-state variable times the change in capital. And now we have another co-state variable because we have another stock variable N. We need to add that to the Hamiltonian as well. Right? Then we have the first order conditions. We now have 3 first order conditions. No, we have 4 of them. The first 2 are the same. dH taken to C should equal 0, and then the change in the shadow price minus the discount rate times the shadow price should equal the change, the first pass derivative of the Hamiltonian to the capital stock that goes with that shadow price. And we need to do the same for the P's, because that's another decision that we make, how much to invest in environmental protection. So the HDP should equal 0. The HDP is marginal utility, but now marginal utility in terms of environmental amenities. Then, of course, how do environmental amenities change with P? So the NDP, we find the chain rule, and that should equal the co-state variable mu, right? Minus mu 0 is equal to the co-state variable. For the co-state variable, we have another horrendous differential equation. We rewrite the Hamiltonian according to the static first order conditions to get this expression here. We approximate it, linearize it through this thing here. We divide both sides of the equation by marginal utility, because the Hamiltonian is of course defined in utils. That's something that we're interested in maximizing, so that's why we marginalize it to express in money terms. And we have consumption plus investment minus depreciation, the change in the capital stock, the change in the natural capital stock, times how much we can change that. So this is essentially the effectiveness of our environmental protection. And then this is the value of that environmental, the value of the environment. So So this is the marginal utility of the environment divided by the marginal utility of consumption. So now we have expressed the marginal utility of the environment in money terms. And just as we said, well, the Hamiltonian, or the normalized Hamiltonian, equals net domestic product. Actually, we knew net domestic product already, but now we have a welfare interpretation of the net domestic product. Now we have a welfare interpretation of, we have derived a product that is the welfare equivalent of us when we don't just care about material consumption, but we also care about the environment and, right? So this thing is called the environmental product. It's the net domestic product plus the monetized increase in nature. And of course, if nature is decreasing in value or in size, then this term becomes negative, right? So that is how we define the environmental product. And this was done by a much older Weizmann. This is a 1909 paper, the previous one was from 75 or 76. So this is the theory. Nothing to be scared of here, right? It's just a bunch of equations, it's just a trick. How do I maximize this particular thing? And then we actually did not fully solve it, right? I did not solve the differential equations. But gave it an interpretation nonetheless. This won't be on the exam. This might be on the exam. 3 years before Weizmann sort of formalized what does net domestic product really mean, and what is it? 29 years before he extended that theory to include the environment. Nordhaus, last year's Nobel laureate, and Tobin, who won the Nobel Prize, I think, in the 80s, but don't quote me on that, he definitely won one, introduced a measure of economic welfare, where they measure the welfare of consumption. This is not about economic production. And essentially what they said is what we should do is take gross domestic, gross national product, in their case, maybe net national product, and subtract the economic bads, with which they meant repairs, right? So we go into an NDP, but also pollution control, because we're not doing this, we're not controlling pollution because we want to increase welfare, but rather because we want to prevent damage to economic welfare. We should subtract things, other defensive expenditures, like defense and the police. It's not that we like having police around, but police is there to prevent crime from happening. So it's not something that increases welfare, but rather something that prevents losses of welfare. And then of course we should add household production, we should add leisure, we should add things that are not measured in GDP because they're illegal, but they nevertheless increase economic welfare, right? So one thing that statisticians have to cope with is in those countries that legalized marijuana, GDP jumped. Because all of a sudden those things, all those sales of joints and everything that used not to be measured, now all of a sudden were measured, right? And they definitely increase welfare. So those things should be added. Which is a very ad hoc way of doing it. Essentially they sort of follow the same reasoning as Kuznets did in the net domestic product versus gross domestic product. they just started adding things. And they immediately admitted that it was a very primitive way of doing it, and it was a very experimental way of doing this. But this is still how it is being done. So the sort of formal derivation that I showed you previously has not gained a lot of traction, but most people, most statistics agencies use essentially this method, that you start with GDP and then you start adding things that you don't like, and you start adding things that you do like and you start subtracting things that you don't like. And this goes by a range of names. The Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare, the Genuine Progress Indicator, Sustainable Net Benefit Index, or the measure of domestic progress. And lots and lots of numbers have been published on this. And here we see one incarnation, the Genuine Progress Indicator. It doesn't say in my notes. Oh wait, this is for the US, where if you look at GDP per capita, it sort of seems to have stagnated, but GPI per capita, all sorts of other things have improved, and therefore, even though material consumption is sort of stagnated in this data, actually people are getting better and better off because the environment is cleaning up, health is getting better, and so on and so forth. Note that series ends in 2004, right? In the last couple of years, life expectancy in the US have actually been falling, and the environment is getting dirtier again. So perhaps that trend is now reversed, but for this period of time, that is actually the case, right? And I've said this already. There's all sorts of issues with this approach, right? How do you deal with the depletion of oil stocks or the depletion of water stocks? It's hard to value, but also hard to measure of themselves. Of course, GDP is measured in dollars or in pounds, so everything that happens in the environment has to be monetized as well. It is arbitrary, what you call a defensive expenditure, and what is something that is productive. An example that comes to mind is a dike that you can build, and you could argue, well, that is a purely defensive expenditure. It protects against floods, but it has no other function until you start traveling the world and you see that people do all sorts of things with dikes, including recreation, or not so much like to enjoy yourself, but being impressed by the buildings that you see. There's a lot of tourism. Actually, people visit the Dutch coast just to be in awe of the engineering, but you would also see a lot of sheep grazing on those things. You would see dikes being used as roads and so on and so forth. So what share of the dike is really defensive and what share of the dike is really a productive asset? If you're going to include indicators of inequality, you need to wonder how does that compare to the total level of income, and because it is somewhat arbitrary, you can start to massage the numbers in a particular way. The final point I want to make here is that this very clearly reflects a weak sustainability perspective on the dynamics, right? What we say is we're just adding everything up, and that means that an increase in accumulation of physical capital can offset the deterioration of environmental or natural capital. As long as one is larger than the other, as long as the physical capital accumulation is larger than the environmental deaccumulation, it doesn't matter, right? Despite all this, this is what the officers of national statistics around the world have been doing. And what I'm going to do in the next few minutes, and I've also put links on Canvas, is to show you what the UK Office of National Statistics have done. And they're actually one of the more advanced in the world. So I put on Canvas links to the UK environmental accounts and to the UK natural capital accounts. And I'm going to show you a few examples of this. And what you would see is that if you follow that link, is that there's tons of data, right? The ONS, it's their job to collect statistics, and that is what they do. And if you ask them to collect environmental statistics or environmental accounts, that is what they will do, and they will collect loads and loads and loads of them. Despite the volume of numbers that you see there, you immediately notice that there are very severe limitations. They don't have emissions to water, for instance. Water doesn't exist. They don't have emissions to soil, which is a bit peculiar. Not entirely peculiar, because it's much easier to count emissions to air and pretend that air is the same everywhere, whereas if you count emissions to water, you need to make a distinction between every tiny little river in the UK, right? So it's just much more work, but there is no reason not to do it. There's a very heavy emphasis in the national accounts, environmental accounts, on energy and carbon dioxide. That partly reflects the fact that these are statistics that are easy to gather. It also reflects political priorities. Even though ONS is supposed to be neutral in policy terms, they do respond to politicians saying we care about climate change, and therefore there shall be lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of statistics about the political priority, right? They do have data on particulates, they do have data on heavy metals that I will show in a second. They also have accounts on environmental expenditure. So there's annual surveys going out to companies, how much did you pay to protect the environment? And that is reported. The statistics on environmental tax revenue, and there's the material flow accounts. All of this is done in their physical units. So here's an example of the environmental accounts for heavy metals. Very small numbers, right? Because there's loads of them. And what you see, this is for vanadium. Now you may wonder, what is vanadium? It's toxic, right? Why do we care about this? It's a heavy metal. It is toxic. It makes these mushrooms unedible to humans, right? And that is because of the vanadium that is in there. Why do we use this stuff if it's toxic? Well, it actually makes steel better. If you make an alloy of iron and other metals like vanadium, you get much more flexible and durable steel. That is why we use it. And that explains why emissions are so very high compared to the rest in manufacturing. This is because that is what we use it for. The other main source of vanadium is that there's trace elements of vanadium in coal and in diesel. So you see power generation pop up as a big emitter, and you see transport popping up as a big emitter, right? But it also shows up everything. And the material or the environmental accounts allow you to trace the emissions of this particular substance over time, right? It starts in 1990. I think the latest data are for 2014, maybe a bit later. And by broad sector, that is what you see at the top, but also by detailed sector. And yes, this number here runs to 101. So for 100 different economic activities, you can trace for more than 20 years, 25 years, where did this stuff come from, right? So if you are a person who is keen on vanadium, you can actually trace all this, right? And you can see where did it come from. It also tells you who paid environmental taxes and how much. And what you see here is a comparison between 1997 and 2016, where in 1997 we paid slightly more than 20 billion pounds per year in environmental taxes, and that has gone up to almost 50 by 2016. And then that is split by sector, and what you notice is that in 1997 actually households paid the environmental taxes, or 60% of environmental taxes was paid by households, the easy target, right? By 2016 more of the tax burden had shifted to industry. So you can see things like that. And then they also publish the material flow accounts, which is just tons of stuff, right? So here we're looking at biomass, how much biomass in kilograms, right, was produced in the UK, crops, crop residues, wood, fish. So this 818 is essentially the total weight of the fish catch, right? And you can trace that over time. This is the domestic stuff. Then how much of these things were imported, again in weight, and also for some reason we were importing limestone, and gypsum and clays were imported, and sand was imported, and this tells you how much sand was imported, right, in case you ever wondered. But then also how much of this is stuff, right, was exported. So that is what the environmental accounts will tell you. And some people get very excited about these numbers. You guys look less impressed. And then the Official of National Statistics also publishes, and it's actually technically more advanced, it's a different team that does it, the natural capital accounts, where here everything is monetized, and they calculate the annual value of services provided by nature. And there's three types of services. One is provisioning. There is fish that we can catch. One is regulation. Air pollutants are removed by trees, and therefore we have lower health problems. So that is valuable, and then also recreation. And this is more advanced, but it's also, for some things we have numbers and therefore they're included, and other things we don't have numbers and therefore they're not included. And this is a time series by sector of what is the value of stuff we got out of nature. And in red is essentially the value of the oil that we got out of the North Sea. And then in blue is the value of total agricultural production, and where are our fish? That's in orange. So for all the talk of the Brexiteers about fish and how important fish is, right? There's very little orange on this graph, right? That's why I had to look. So this is intriguing, perhaps. This is another service that is provided by nature. And as I just said, trees take pollutants out of the atmosphere, and therefore they don't harm us. And trees actually like this sort of stuff because they're food, essentially. So if you're worried about PM10, then you see actually a lot of it is removed from the air by woodland, and this is the volume that is removed. If you worry about PM2.5, this is the stuff that can make you severely ill, but definitely makes you dumber as well, right? Affects cognition as well as health. This is mostly health issues, and you see who takes it out. Whereas if you're worried about ammonia, yeah, that's ammonia, then you see that actually it's grass that is and wheat that is taking up most of that. So this is where it disappears into. And then they also have data on where do you go to enjoy yourself. And lo and behold, most people enjoy themselves in cities, right? That's the dark blue. And there's also a lot of people at the beaches, right? This is essentially time spent in particular environments. And then this is the same time series, but now in the value, right? So this is the hour spent on the beach in orange versus in town in blue, and this is the value. So people enjoy being on the beach more than being in town. No surprises there. And all of that is available as a time series. Actually goes back a bit further in time. So that is what is done in practice. The World Bank is taking this a step further. Don't laugh. You can't help it. So this is Manfred Marx-Neve, who formulated the threshold hypothesis, right? For every society there seems to be a period in which economic growth brings about an improvement in the quality of life, but only up to a point, the threshold point beyond which, if there's more economic growth, quality of life may begin to deteriorate. So this is the sustainability question. Essentially. Kirk Hamilton has long led a project at the World Bank, and it used to be called genuine saving. Nowadays it's known as adjusted net saving, and this is the World Bank's flagship project to measure sustainability. And essentially genuine saving or adjusted net saving is defined as net investment in manufactured capital, physical capital, minus the net depreciation in natural capital plus the net investment in human capital. And you see there's sort of values going into this, right? Manufactured capital, we sort of presume that it increases. Human capital, we sort of presume that it increases. Natural capital, environmental capital, we sort of presume that it falls over time. But of course the middle term could also have been phrased as plus the net investment in natural capital. Now, if you recall our definition of the environmental domestic product, then genuine saving is just the difference, the first difference of this thing, right? So that is essentially what they measure. They measure the change in capital stock. And then going back to Marx-Neve, if your genuine savings are smaller than zero, then you're unsustainable. You're essentially depreciating your capital stock. You have less and less left to produce things in the future. And if your genuine savings is greater than zero, then at least you're weakly sustainable, right? So this is the theory that genuine savings is net investments in physical, natural, and human capital. This is the practice. What they can only include what they can measure. So they have the extraction of some fossil fuels, not all fossil fuels, extraction of minerals, cutting down of forests. Then in terms of environment, they care about two things only. One is greenhouse gas emissions, and the other is particulate matter. And for particulate matter, they only count the health implications of particulate matter, but not other things. And then for natural or for human capital, they only have education spending, but not actually any measure of us getting smarter, right? This can also, of course, be, as you would see in the UK, ever more dormitories for students going up, right? That would be an environmental expenditure, but not something that necessarily makes you smarter. That's the capital expenditure that you see there. Or the operational expenditure could be going up, and that is by chancellors earning ever more money rather than you guys getting smarter, right? but that is the measure that they use. So graphically for Bolivia for 2003, we have the gross saving, then we subtract the depreciation of fixed capital, so we go to net saving, right? Then we add the investment in human capital, so we go up again, and then we subtract the depletion of natural resources, so we go down again, and then we have to subtract the damages done by pollution, so we go down again as well. And what you see is that if you look at your standard national account measure of savings, it seems as if Bolivia is doing well, it's getting richer, its capital stock is growing, but once you start correcting for all the other things, Bolivia is actually getting worse in 2003. They've done this for all sorts of countries. They've done this for all countries, actually, rather than all sorts. And this is an older graph. Sort of the black squares is the world as a whole, where you see the genuine savings are positive. So the world as a whole is getting better. But for large parts of the world, it's actually not at all the case. North Africa and Middle East are actually deteriorating, and that is because most of their wealth accumulation is because they're subtracting oil, but also sub-Saharan Africa, you actually see that if there is economic growth, it actually mostly comes at the expense of the environment, right? So this is up to the year 2000. The time series, they actually have this going forward in time. This is for 2016, the latest numbers that are available for every country in the world. And what you see is that some countries are doing very, very well. Sri Lanka, for instance, is investing heavily in physical capital and education at the moment. And other countries, Timor-Leste, Mozambique, Liberia, you see are actually rapidly getting worse, right? This goes to minus 80%. Is how quickly they are deteriorating, particularly the natural environment. Liberia, that's mostly deforestation. What is driving this? So that is the World Bank's effort for all this. Turn on. All sorts of things that are missing, right? I showed you actually what is included, which was a short list, so the things that are excluded is rather long, and here are just some examples. Fisheries is not there, soil erosion is not there, water pollution is not there, diamonds are not there, human capital depreciation is not there. We just assume, we're just counting investing in people, but we're not actually also including that knowledge deteriorates and people disappear. Social capital is not there, and so on and so forth. They're working on it, but it's not there yet. There is, of course, also a whole bunch of people who disagree with all this and are developing alternative indicators. And I have 3 listed here. The United Nations is particularly keen on the Human Development Index, and they're promoting this heavily, and I really wonder why. The Human Development Index consists of 3 sub-indices. One is GDP per capita, the second is life expectancy of birth, and the third is education, which is composite index. It consists 2/3 of the adult literacy rate, how many people can read and write, or at least claim they can read and write, and of the children, what fraction is included in schools, right? Or what fraction of children goes to school. So those are 3 completely different things: education, health, income. So how do you average them? Well, very simple. You scale them from 0 to 1. Where the country with the lowest GDP per capita gets a 0, the country with the highest GDP per capita gets a 1, and then the rest is scaled linearly between that. Ditto for life expectancy, ditto for adult literacy rate. and enrollment, and then you take the average of the three indices, and that's a human development index. This is completely and totally ad hoc, right? Completely and totally ad hoc that this is somehow a welfare indicator. Also, the scale changes, right? So, if sort of life expectancy at birth tends to change little from year to year, so the scale from 0 to 1 is always roughly between 44 and 75 years. That's roughly the minimum and the maximum. GDP per capita can increase much more rapidly, and that means that you can drop in your GDP per capita if a country as Luxembourg, which is the richest country on the planet, is growing very, very rapidly in a particular year, then the rest is falling, even though they're growing, actually falling relatively. And that can drag you down just because the Luxembourgians are getting richer, right? Stuff like that. And that also means that the relative weight that is given to one indicator versus the other changes over time because of that rescaling from 0 to 1 that happens every year, right? So it's a very peculiar indicator. I'm going to talk about the ecological footprint in a minute. Let's first look at a Happy Planet Index, which is a recent invention that people seem to be particularly impressed about. The Happy Planet Index is life satisfaction, self-reported, so they do these annual surveys, how happy do you feel, and then people have to answer between 0 and 10. Life expectancy, how long do you enjoy this particular state of happiness, and that is then divided by the ecological footprint. Now, if you have any inclination of how ratio works, this is very peculiar. The ecological footprint, or life satisfaction, is between 2.7 and 8 empirically. Life expectancy for the data available is between 44 and 75. And then the ecological footprint is between 2% and 100. Now, if you're going to divide by something very small, you get a very large number, right? So this indicator is completely and totally dominated by small numbers in the ecological footprint, right? And that is why we see this particular ranking, the Happy Planet Index, has correctly Zimbabwe at the bottom. Zimbabwe is a horrendous place to live. Congo is another awful place, but it has Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador in the top 10. This is the triangle of death, right? This is where the murder rate is through the roof. That is why the southern border of the US is so fractious at the moment, because people are fleeing these countries because of the murder rate and because of the crime. But according to this particular index, it's one of the best places to live. If we zoom in where we are, the United Kingdom scores slightly below Libya. Right? God. How do you dare publish this stuff? The United States is only slightly above Ivory Coast. Ivory Coast, is not a good place to be. Silly, right? But it's dominated by dividing by the ecological footprint. So the ecological footprint is another particularly popular way of looking at sustainability and an indicator for environmental performance. You very regularly see pieces on the BBC and The Guardian about this stuff. And essentially what they're trying to do is measure how much things we use, how much things we emit, and translate everything into the land area that would be needed to sustain it, right? And that is why it's a footprint. It essentially measures your lifestyle and expresses it as the land area area required to provide all the things that you consume, and also to absorb all the stuff that you emit, right? And essentially we go back here to an absolute value system, right? This is essentially what the physiocrats said, that the measure of value of everything is the amount of land. And that is essentially what the ecological footprint does as well. So we go back to the physiocrats. The two guys who came up with this are Bill Rees, who you see on the right, and now I forget his first name, Wackernagel, who's from Austria, no slide there. Matthias Wackernagel, who is the main promoter of the thing. He travels the world and tries to convince people that this is the most brilliant thing since the invention of GDP by Kuznets. So what do you do if you're worried about CO2 emissions? How does that is that included in the ecological footprint? Essentially it is, if you emit 10 tons of CO2 this year, how many trees should you plant to take that CO2 out of the atmosphere again, and then how much land do those trees take up? If you eat meat, how much land is needed for grazing the cows that you just ate, and so on and so forth, right? It just translates everything into land. And then this particular picture emerges. This is a time series of the average land area that we use to absorb our emissions and provide for our consumption over time. And you see it's growing. There's more people who consume ever more stuff. And then the one that you see there is essentially how much land do we have, right? And what you see is that if this particular calculation is correct, we are currently, or rather in the year 2007, are consuming only 1.4%, 140% of our land area. And we have only 100% of our land area, but we're using 140% of that. So we're 40% unsustainable, right? That is essentially what they say. And this is the world average, and what you would see is that if you read The Guardian, then the average UK person would use 7 times the amount of land that is available to the average UK person, right? Things like that. And then people get all worried. The dominant factor here is the grey area, which is our CO2 emissions. CO2 emissions are about climate, not about land. It is the hypothetical amount of land that you would need to plant forests, but you can do other things, you can plant other things. You can use those forests for biofuel production. You can also count it as the number of land. So you could alternatively count the land occupied by wind turbines that you would need to supply this. Of course, you can put those wind turbines also at sea, right? And then all of a sudden you have a much larger acreage available, and so on and so forth. So this is particularly troublesome, and there are some jokers who say that the ecological footprint is really an indicator for intelligence of the people who peddle this rather than for anything else. So much for what happens at the national level. Let's look briefly at what happens at the company level. And companies, particularly large companies, but increasingly also smaller companies, report their environmental performance as well. And they do that to please different constituencies. Obviously, companies are afraid of negative publicity. Consumer boycotts, those sort of things. If you have the sort of image of being a dirty company, then people won't buy your stuff, right? So that is one reason to report on your environmental performance, to convince your buyers that what you're selling is clean. I've said this before, also increasingly you need to convince your workers that your company is a good company, right? And not just your current workers, but also people who you are trying to hire. Similarly, you need to convince your investors that in the future you will be able to hire the smartest people, and one of the aspects there is that you're a ethical company, and that you won't be subject to consumer boycotts. So you also need to convince your investors that what you're doing is good for the environment, for society, as well as for the bottom line, for profits. And there's also increasing numbers of investors who are ethical in and of themselves. One of the largest investors are, of course, pension funds. And the pension funds invest money on behalf of people like me, and in the not too distant future, people like you. And you may go to your pension fund and say, no, you should not be investing in BP, British Petroleum, because of climate change. And we think that is a bad investment, and it's an unethical investment, and therefore I do not want my pension money to be invested in companies like that. So investors may also have an intrinsic motive. The investors are not. It's a common misconception that the big investors are sort of anonymous, a small group of rich guys. No, the biggest investors are the pension funds, right? And last but certainly not least, you of course also need to convince your regulators that you are abiding by the laws, right? And you're only allowed to emit so and so much of this stuff and nothing at all of that other stuff. You need to convince your regulators that you're indeed following the law. But also, you want to fend off potential future regulation. So at the moment we are all worried about plastics, and you guys have all written essays on plastics, and it seems likely that there will be more regulation on plastics down the line. But if you as a company can convince Whitehall that you have already this problem under control, then you may convince them that you don't need future regulation, right? The problem is going away, and please don't regulate it. So that is the reasons why companies do this. Now what I've done, rather than talk about this in theory and in abstracto, I looked at the environmental accounts of the 5 largest public companies in the UK in order of size. That is HSBC, Unilever, British Petroleum, BHP Billiton, and AstraZeneca, right? That's an intriguing read, and if you're keen, you should read these reports themselves. They're just on the internet somewhere. So what we're looking at here is HSBC's, I forget what they call it, but this is the environment part. And what they do is or what they say they do, is support sustainable growth. We aim to grow our business in a sustainable way with a focus on moving to a low carbon economy, protect our planet, recognize our duty to support the communities in which we operate. And then look at what they really do is they report numbers of sustainable finance. So what they say is that in the near future, well, by 2025, 100 billion will be invested in green companies. And so far, in 2017, they have realized almost 30 billion of that, right? So that is, and then they give a breakdown where it is, mostly in Europe, because that's where they're active. A good bit in Asia, because they're active there as well, right? Their target is also that 100% of the electricity that they will use will come from renewable sources by the end of the decade, 2030, you can't read that. And in 2017, they've realized 29% of their electricity comes from it, right? So that is the sort of stuff that they report. But their focus is very clearly, we are an investment bank, right? That's what we are. So what matters is where do we put our investment? And what they claim is that an increasing share of their investment goes into green companies. So that is what HSBC claims to do in their environment report. Unilever is a different company, right? This is mostly consumer stuff. And they report on all sorts of things. In blue, they claim to improve the health and well-being for more than 1 billion of their customers. And that 1 billion is no exaggeration, right? This is their customer base. Unilever sells shampoo, sells food, sells soap and all sorts of things. And in their environment report, and again you can't read this, they say that we sell soap. And soap is good because people wash their hands, and if people wash their hands they don't get diarrhea. Aren't we a good company? Right? That is what Unilever says. And they also say such things, they're reducing the amount of trans fats in their products, they're reducing the amount of sugar in their products, they're reducing the amount of salt in their products, and aren't we great? Right? Could of course make the argument, yeah, this is what the consumer wants, right? And we're just following the trends, but they're taking credit for that. They're also improving their own operations. And that is the green bit that you see there. That they're increasing their greenhouse gas emissions. They plan to halve the greenhouse gas emissions, but accidentally increased by 6%. So they're honest, right? But if you just focus on the CO2 in their operations, then that has fallen by half. But if you actually look at the life cycle, then it actually increased by 6%. That is to say, they outsourced a whole lot of stuff, right, to other companies. Give similar numbers on the water that they use. This is actually important, right, because a lot of it is consumer products that they make. The amount of waste that they produced, and I don't know how they did this, but they promised to cut their waste stream, the amount of waste that they produce relative to the volume of stuff that they produce, by 97% between 2008 and 2020, which means that they're recycling more and more and more and more. We're actually getting up to the thermodynamic limits here. And then the third thing that they say is, we are good employers, we create opportunities for women, we have fairness in the workplace, those sort of things. Again, this is important because this is a large employer, right? Lots and lots of people work for Unilever. So this is essentially what they say they do. We make good products, our operations are good, and we are a good place to work. British Petroleum, of course, has a problem because they are an inherently dirty business. They sell oil and gas, right? They are dirty. So they have set targets for its operational emissions. They say that the way we pump the oil out of the ground and the way we refine the oil is ever better. We use less and less energy for refinement and for transport and so on and so forth. And at the same time, they deny any liability for the products that they sell, right? They say it's our job to take it out of the ground, to refine it and to sell it on. What our clients do with it, that's their business, that's not us. But we try to make that middle step as clean as possible. That's our responsibility. And there's obviously people who disagree with that. Right? In order to mitigate that, they do in their report emphasize all their lobbying activities, or rather, they emphasize their lobbying activities for more stringent climate policy and more stringent environmental policy. Their tone is very much, we are on the side of the environmentalists, right? And this is, of course, to fend off any sort of backlash that they may suffer. So that is BP. BHP Billiton is another miner of all sorts of stuff, not oil and gas, but or coal, but all sorts of everything. And they focus on operational performance, right? They say we do the best that we can. Yes, we emit a lot, it's very energy intensive, it's very chemical intensive what we do. If you're mining iron ore, before you have iron out, you need to use all sorts of very dirty chemicals to separate the iron from the other stuff that you've dug out of the ground, but we're minimizing our environmental pressure per ton of iron produced. They also, and that's important, these environmental reports don't come as standalone environment reports, but they come as societal reports. So BHP Billiton, and that's the top line that you see, also emphasizes that last year only 2 people died of their workforce while on the job, right? Which, given that it's actually very dangerous work that they do, is quite impressive, right? And if you compare this to what it was like 50 years ago, then they would have reported probably thousands of deaths, because these are miners, right? These are people working underground in very dirty and very dangerous circumstances with big machinery that if you let it go, it will crush you and mutilate you, whatever. There's actually an impressive number. Of course, the fact that 2 people died of your workforce while on the job is serious, right? It's too many. And then they also emphasize that the middle line, that they sponsor sports and arts and all those things, right? Look how good we are, we support things that are important. And then finally, AstraZeneca, which makes medicine, right? Medical products. It's actually the weakest of the reports. It's mostly, yeah, we set targets and we're meeting our targets, but very little objectively on the performance, right? 83% of employees feel that AstraZeneca is a great place to work, right? They do emphasize their operational performance, right? 8% reduction in our water use. But it's mostly we set targets and we met targets. So what do we make of all this? And this I could of course continue with the next 20 largest companies. Lots of glossy material, right? Lots of claims. Very little standardization. These were 5 companies. There's not a common number, almost no common number between them, which makes it very difficult to say whether these companies are good or bad, right? Of course, in their own reports, they claim to be doing all sorts of good stuff. Do they really? Which of these 5 companies is the best for the environment? Very hard to say. Are these trends as expected? Do they do better than what you would expect for a company in this industry of this size? Or do they do worse than what you expect? So it is very hard to make sense of all this, right? Very hard to use it in sort of a standard way. If you compare the reports over time, format changes, indicators change. It's very hard to say what is really going on here. Now, some people would then throw back at me and say, well, these sustainability reports, as they're typically called, are audited, right? But McKinsey audited them, and some of the other big 4 audited them. But that just means that the numbers that are in there are true. It does not mean that the numbers that are in there are the right numbers to report. It does not mean that there's numbers that should have been in there but are not, right? That's not what auditing is about. Auditing simply says if you say 8, then it is 8. It doesn't mean that 8 is a meaningful number to report, or a good number for that matter. There is a movement towards certification, right? That you can go to a voluntary organization and say, this is my environmental performance, and now I get a blue tick, and now I'm good, right? Those certification is typically voluntary, typically very low standards, so that doesn't mean anything much either, right? So to sum up, there is movement towards environmental accounting, both at a national level and at a corporate level. There's a lot and lots of numbers around, but numbers are easier to come by than insights. That's unfortunately where we are. Those were almost the last things I wanted to say. Don't forget to vote on Thursday. You probably guessed my preferences here. Now you should take technical voting very seriously this time. It was a pleasure to teach you guys, and good luck with the exam.